Hi, good morning. My name is Lorraine Jacobs. Mark Miller and I are co-chair of the Sunday Morning Forum. We welcome and thank you for supporting the Sunday Forums. For over 50 years, First Unitarian Society Milwaukee, the Sunday Forum, has sponsored the Sunday Forum lecture series, showcasing speakers. Forums are 1 hour in length and provide a presentation followed by questions. Scheduling and hosting these weekly programs is accomplished by volunteers. The presenters do not receive honoraria. The content of each forum may not always align with the viewpoint of First Unitarian Society Milwaukee. They are meant to offer topics which can be pursued further independently. I would like to, before we begin, remind people that next Sunday, March 20th, our topic will be working towards a more equitable and sustainable Milwaukee County, with Chairwoman Marcelia Nicholson presenting. That forum will be at 10:30 to 11:30. It'll be a Zoom event with live stream here in Max Auto Hall. If you come here, vaccination proof, and you will have to wear a mask. Seating will be limited. Okay, and today we welcome Jacob Serfling, and he'll be introduced by Mark Miller.
Yes, Jacob is going to go right ahead. So thanks, Jacob, for being willing to do this.
Well, absolutely. Thank you for having me. Very honored that you reached out to have us be a part of the Sunday Forum. As Mark said, my name is Jacob Serfling. I'm one of the co-directors of the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition. And this is our Building Decarbonization 101 presentation that we give periodically to new folks coming into our coalition and other interested groups. So I've got a pretty full agenda for the presentation. In all honesty, almost all of these could be their own hour-long presentation, but this is just sort of to give an overview of the topic and the work that we're trying to do in the Midwest. Just to touch a little bit on the Midwest BDFC itself, we were founded in 2019 with the mission to develop and implement equitable strategies to achieve zero emissions from the Midwest building sector by 2050. Within that, we have the sub-goal of trying to end fossil fuel building heating-based construction by 2030. And when we say the Midwest, we are considering this 8-state region of Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, Ohio, Missouri, Indiana, and Iowa. So I'm based out of Des Moines, Iowa. I'm mostly focused on our building technology and policy work. Prior to doing this, I was a practicing engineer for about a decade, focused on building mechanical systems and building energy usage. My two other co-directors are Marnice Jackson, who's based out of Michigan, and Margaret Turney-Hendrick, who's based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And then our team also consists of Eric Fowler, who handles our communications work. He's based out of Minnesota as well. So diving into the topic, we know we have a mouthful of an organization name. So I think there's a lot of questions usually about what that means. And kind of the first step there is defining what do we mean by decarbonization. So we're talking about converting any of our human energy using activities that are currently directly burning fossil fuels to some sort of clean carbon-free source. And when we talk about those activities, they tend to fall into 3 main buckets. One being transportation, the second being industrial processes, and then the third being the building sector, commercial and residential buildings. And then on top of that, there's kind of a fourth intermediate bucket, and that would be electric generation, where we're using that fossil fuel burning and converting it to electricity before it provides energy to one of those other 3 energy end uses. So when we're specifically talking about building decarbonization, decarbonizing that third bucket of commercial and residential buildings, what does that consist of? And there's three main parts to it. The first being energy efficiency or weatherization, basically reducing how much energy those buildings have to use in the first place. The second is a concept called beneficial electrification. So taking any of the activities that are directly burning fossil fuels at the building site and converting them to something that runs on electricity. And then the third is that carbon-free energy generation, making sure that the electricity that's provided to all of those appliances and equipment comes from a carbon-free source. So the order that I put those in when talking about building decarbonization was somewhat intentional. I have a friend who does sustainable building design consulting out here in Iowa, and she is fond of the phrase reduce and then produce when she's working with her clients. And basically what she's getting at there is that a lot of them, when they want to do a green building project, they'll immediately jump into, well, where can we put solar panels and things like that? And she's trying to make the point to them of really it's going to be more effective both in terms of cost and sustainability to first focus on reducing how much energy that building needs first, and then talk about how much of that energy they can produce on site. When we're talking about building decarbonization, I like to expand that phrase a little bit and go reduce, replace, and then produce. So first focusing on how much of that energy, building energy usage we can reduce, then replacing any direct fossil fuel burning appliances in that building with the electrical component, and then looking at where that electricity is produced. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of why that order of operations is important as we go. So what is all actually entailed in some of those different steps? Looking first at that reduce step, we're really looking at limiting the amount of heating and cooling that a building needs, or trying to shift that energy use from high peak time so that you're not calling for too much electricity at any one given time. And the main ways that we really tackle that end of it when we're talking about decarbonization is first focusing on the building envelope. And that can mean traditional weatherization measures like air sealing. That can mean higher performance insulation or windows, basically anything that's going to keep heat where you want it, whether it be inside the building during the winter or outside the building in the summer. That can also mean the usage of heat recovery systems that capture wasted heat from the building. So a really common version of that is if you have exhaust fans, say in restrooms or things like that, they're taking air that you've already heated in the building and shooting it outside, and then you're bringing in fresh air from outside to replace it that then needs to be heated up. A heat recovery system transfers some of that heat from the air going out of the building to the heat coming in so that you then don't have to directly heat it as much. I would also include in this category different types of controls technologies that are out there in terms of smart thermostats that are can be programmed to make sure that you're not unnecessarily heating or cooling a building when you don't need that for human comfort, or this emerging idea of grid connected appliances like water heaters that would shift when that tank heats up to provide your hot water to a time when there isn't as much demand for electricity from other parts of the building. So you're keeping that overall amount that needs to get provided, capping it at a lower point. So after we've tackled that, then we talk about replacing. And we're talking about converting appliances like stoves, water heaters, or furnaces from something that uses fossil fuels to electricity. So the biggest piece there is really the heating and cooling systems, going from a gas burning furnace or boiler system, typically to some sort of heat pump based system. If you're not familiar with the idea of a heat pump, they're essentially an air conditioner that runs in reverse. So instead of burning a fuel or using electricity and directly converting that into heat, you're just moving heat that exists somewhere else into your building when you want it. So there's an air source version that takes that heat from the air outside of your building, or ground source versions that are drawing that heat from some sort of geothermal source in the ground. Beyond heating or cooling, we're also talking about converting gas-fired stoves to some sort of induction or electric cooktop. We're talking about converting water heaters from a gas-fired tank to, again, most efficient would be some sort of heat pump based method of heating that water. And then other appliances in buildings like clothes dryers and things like that do sometimes use gas, converting those to some sort of electric based system as well. And then the final piece, again, is that produce. And I think these are the methods that folks are probably most familiar with, because they're very visible when we're talking about the way that we tackle this leg of decarbonization. And that's just supplying all those energy needs from a carbon-free source. Now that everything that uses energy in the building is electric, where's that electricity coming from? And that could mean on-site renewable generation, like rooftop solar, or maybe a small on-site wind turbine. That can mean just ensuring that the utility that is providing your purchased electricity is generating from a clean energy source and not gas or coal power plants. That could also mean bringing energy into the building that's non-electric as well. There's a growing trend of community heat systems that use geothermal. So in addition to bringing clean electricity into your building, you'd be hooked up to a district geothermal system that brings clean heat into your building as well. So those are some of the main strategies that we're advocating across the Midwest, and what we're trying to see a higher degree of implementation with. I think the next question that comes up a lot from folks, and fair enough, is why buildings? I had mentioned at the beginning that there's those three main end uses of energy that can come from fossil fuel burning sources. Why have we chosen to focus on buildings specifically instead of one of the other ones? So first off, there's just the overall share of emissions that buildings represent. This data is pulled from the Energy Information Administration. They're a department, or they're an office of the Department of Energy that tracks different statistics on energy usage around the country. And in any given year, you'll see around 35 to 40% of US CO2 emissions can be attributed to residential or commercial buildings. So just right off the bat, they make up a huge share of the CO2 emissions that we have to reduce. Then on top of that, we can compare the progress that we've made on cleaning up the electric grid to the lack of progress that we've made on those building emissions. So this is tracking US CO2 emissions over the course of around 9 years from 2011 to 2018. And you can see over that time, that blue line representing CO2 emissions attributed to electricity went down around 10%. So we retired some coal and gas plants. We brought more wind and solar online, and it hasn't been enough, but we've made definite progress on reducing emissions there. But even though the electricity supplied to the US building sector was getting cleaner, we actually saw a 20% rise in emissions from the building sector over that same span of time. So there's a disconnect here that we have to address. What's the reason for that disconnect? And I apologize. I know that this chart is very busy and complicated. You can the engineer out of the engineering firm, but they still like their graphs. But I think it does kind of make the point that I'm trying to get at here pretty effectively. So on the left-hand side, you see the different sources of energy in terms of fossil fuels in the US. So oil, gas, and coal. And then on the right-hand side, you see those different end-use sectors that we talked about. So transportation, industrial, and then that 35 to 40% that is represented by the building sector. And it's basically showing how much of these different fuels are going to these different end uses. And then in the middle here, you can see the electric power sector. So how much of those fuels are getting converted to electricity and then going on to the end uses. So you can see for the buildings, somewhere between around 65% of the building energy usage is coming from electricity. And so we would expect the emissions associated with that end to go down as electric emissions go down. But I'm going to point out these kind of nasty brown and blue lines going directly from natural gas and oil to the building sector. That represents around 34% of building energy use. And that's the part of that building energy use that is directly burning fossil fuels at the building. So those pieces that haven't been replaced yet, gas furnaces, gas boilers, gas cooking, water heaters, all of those things that aren't converted to electricity. And that's 34% of those building emissions that are not going to go away regardless of what happens with the electric grid, unless a direct action is taken on the buildings. I also want to talk a little bit about why there's some urgency on that, because I think the next question is like, well, okay, we recognize that we at some point need to deal with these direct emissions at the building sector, but why wouldn't we just make sure that we have 100% clean electric grid and then worry about the buildings? And some of that just has to do with the nature of how buildings are built, how long they last. So the American Institute of Architects estimates that upwards of 80% of the buildings that are going to exist in 2050 are already built or under construction. So we're already dealing kind of with the building stock that's going to be playing into our climate goals in 2050, which is kind of the recognized point at which we have to hit zero carbon or even negative carbon from the building sector. And when we look at the individual components, I think it's even more stark. So these are numbers I pulled from some of the building industry trade groups about what the expected lifespan of some of these individual pieces of equipment in a building are. So the average cooking appliance, they're saying, stays in a home around, 15 to 16 years. Your air conditioner or furnace, 18, maybe 20 years you get out of it. An electric service panel is probably going to last around 60 years before it has to get replaced. And then the building shell itself, you would typically expect to last the life of the building. And so they put an average of around 75 years for a building shell. So I'm going to drop this green dashed line here represents the year 2030. if all of these were installed now. And that's, that's our personal target for having zero gas-based new construction in the Midwest. That's also the target that a lot of cities and states, have set for their specific climate goals. And you can see here that all of those pieces of equipment for a building, if they were installed today, would be playing into those climate goals. So if they're gas, they're likely going to be, playing against whatever CO2 emission goals that jurisdiction has. And I'll drop a second line here. This represents the year 2050, at which we have to hit zero. So let's say, well, we think we can get to our 2030 goals without buildings, but we know that everything has to be hitting around zero by 2050. And so maybe you'd have a shot at replacing the heating system or the water heater and the cooking appliances in that building before 2050, even if you put in a gas appliance today. But you'll see that the shell and the electric service, you're probably still dealing with what's going to be installed then. And that's why things like having electric ready requirements to make sure that electric services to homes are properly sized to accommodate electric heating in the future, or building codes that are making sure that the shells of new building construction are optimized for eventually going to electric heat are important, because otherwise you're going to be looking at either retiring some pieces of equipment in the building before the end of their life, so you're eating the cost and the material waste associated with all of that, or you're not going to be able to properly replace them at that time to meet climate goals. So even though we have some time on this, just the nature of how long buildings last mean this is something that we have to start thinking about right now. I also want to talk about how buildings can really play in with some of the other progress that we are making on the electric grid. So I apologize, it's another graph. This is based off of an electric utility in Minnesota that has done a good job about publicly releasing their historical emissions data and their future goals on emissions. So they released how much CO2 per unit of energy they estimated they were at 2005. They gave an update in 2019 about the progress they had made. They have a specific 2030 target that they've made public that they're trying to hit. And then there's the ultimate goal of them going to 100% renewables at some point between 2030 and 2040. So I overlaid that onto how much heat I would estimate a typical 2-bedroom Midwest home to use. So in 2005, this is about the time that I entered the industry, you can see based on the emissions there that, what I got told and what was true at the time was that a high efficiency gas furnace was probably actually the best thing that you could have installed at that time in terms of emissions, because the fuel mix for the electric grid was still pretty dirty. So even if you had a fairly high efficiency heat pump back in 2005, there was so much coal and gas behind what was providing that electricity that probably still had pretty high emissions. And if you had a really old or inefficient electric system like electric baseboards or something like that, it was even worse. So it was back in 2005. Now let's get closer to today and see what's changed. So over that span of 14 years, they've retired a fair amount of that coal and brought on more wind and solar energy to provide that electricity. You still don't want a very inefficient electric system, but if you have a high efficiency heat pump, now the electricity serving it is clean enough that is the lowest amount of emissions for heating that home. And the real important thing that I want to point out is just to reiterate that natural gas furnace, those red points, that's a straight line. Nothing that's happened with the electric grid has changed the emissions picture with that natural gas furnace. It's going to put out the same amount of CO2 and other pollution at that point as it did the day it was installed. So now let's project those systems further as that utility moves towards their 2030 targets of even more wind and solar and retiring more of that coal. Now that straight line of the natural gas furnace keeps going, it's staying exactly the same. And even that least efficient electric system now has less emissions than that gas furnace because of how much cleaner the electricity serving it is. And you see how even more beneficial that high efficiency heat pump has gotten over that time. And then obviously, as we move to renewables, any of the electric systems would trend towards zero emissions. Still probably want that high efficiency heat pump just for utility bill and pocketbook reasons, but they're both approaching almost zero emissions for heating that home. And again, that natural gas furnace is the same as the day it was installed. So these are two aspects of addressing CO2 that work hand in hand: decarbonizing buildings and cleaning up the electric grid. Beyond the emissions picture, there are some other reasons why we are advocates for building decarbonization. One of them is health and safety. Sorry about that. So there's a statistic out there that around 90% of our time in modern society is spent indoors. Those numbers trend up for lower income folks or people with health issues. So the indoor air quality of our homes and businesses is really important. But we know some of these appliances that are directly burning fossil fuels in our homes have big negative impacts on that indoor air quality. So a study that our friends at RMI did, they're a policy and research group based out of Colorado. They looked at homes with gas stoves and found that they had 50 to 400% higher levels of NO2 in those homes, and that children living in those homes were around 24 to 42% more likely to develop asthma symptoms. And there are other studies that have had similar findings, in that Stanford did, found that you don't even have to be running those gas stoves for this to be an issue, that based on the common installation methods and leakage issues with them, that they are likely leaking methane and other nasty emissions into our homes, even when they are off. And now those two studies were specifically focused on gas stoves, but we know other appliances like furnaces and water heaters have similar effects on the indoor air quality of our homes. There's also some economic reasons for focusing on buildings. So these are some insights pulled from another RMI piece that was called The Myth of Stable and Affordable Natural Gas Prices. I know we got them a lot here in Des Moines, and I'm assuming you probably had similar stories come out in your Milwaukee outlets about spiking utility bills and gas prices for your furnaces this winter, based both on what's happening with the gas supply chain, and also just it was anticipated to be a colder winter. So that piece said that the Department of Energy was estimating that US heating prices were projected to go up around 27% for gas customers. And we know that it was much higher than that 27% in certain markets, but we're only projected to go up around 4% for folks that had electric heating in their homes, just because the mix of what was supplying that energy was more stable. And if you look at the EIA website, they're projecting that those natural gas prices are only going to continue to increase. And this was before even what has been happening internationally that will likely to impact that as well. So I suspect that we will not see a return back to those pre-2020 levels of natural gas. And we also know that this is going to hit lower income homes harder than higher income ones. So if you're not familiar with the term energy burden, basically it's the percent of your household income that goes towards paying your utility bills. And we already know that that percentage is much higher for lower income households than higher income ones. But now we're also seeing projections that this increase in natural gas is going to exacerbate that much more for lower income households than higher income ones, almost 10 times more impact in terms of the percentage of their household income that will have to go towards just maintaining heat in their homes. I'm going to talk a little bit about why this is specifically a Midwest issue as well. So just right off the bat, in terms of overall CO2 emissions, not just from buildings, the Midwest is as a region is responsible for over a quarter of the US's emissions. And if you considered that region as its own country, we would be in the top 5 global emitters of CO2 between Russia and Japan. So just as a region, there's kind of a responsibility there to address any CO2 emissions that we have. In terms of buildings in the Midwest, so this is numbers that EIA pulled in terms of what types of fuel was serving residential homes. So nationally, a little under 75% of homes have some sort of fossil fuel heating, whether that be gas or heating oil or some other fossil fuel. In the Midwest, that climbs closer to 90% of homes are served directly by natural gas or heating oil or propane. In terms of water heater, nationally, around 50% of homes have some sort of fossil fuel source. The rest are already electric based. In the Midwest, that's closer to, I think, 68%. So we just have a higher ratio of fossil fuel appliances in our buildings than the rest of the country. And then on top of that, when we talk about heating, we also have higher heating loads than the rest of the country. So this map uses something called heating degree days. Basically, it's adding up all the days that have where the outside temperature is below 65 degrees. So basically the days where you'd start thinking about turning your furnace on, and adding up how many degrees below 65 they were on those days. The important thing is that the higher the number of heating degree days, the more heating load buildings have in that region. And you can see by the US Census region, the top 2 are, in terms of heating degree days, are the ones that make up the Midwest. Really only New England comes close in terms of the heating load. So we have more heating needs to meet, and a much higher percentage of them than the rest of the country right now is getting met by fossil fuels. So this is kind of a uniquely Midwest climate focus in terms of meeting emissions. Before I take some time to get into the challenges to hitting some of the goals that we have as a coalition, I'm just going to take a second to talk about this idea of equitable building decarbonization. This is something that we believe in deeply as a coalition. We've taken a big step back early in our formation to make sure that this was baked into our approach throughout the Midwest. We know that this conversion of buildings to electric or decarbonizing is going to be a massive investment and building infrastructure project in the US, and that historically, though the outcomes and benefits of those types of projects in the US have not been equally distributed. When we talk about equity as a coalition, this is the working definition that our equity working group has come up with, holding ourselves and one another accountable to inclusion in a society in which all can participate, prosper, have value, and reach their full potential. We recognize and work to dismantle injustices, systems, and barriers that prevent some from achieving this goal. So to touch on some of those injustices and systems that we have to dismantle when we're talking about buildings, this is not an exhaustive list, but just kind of a taste of some of the things that we're up against when we're talking about buildings. The states that we cover range from around 35 to 43 affordable units per 100 extremely low income renters. So even beyond working on decarbonizing these building structures, we know that we just have a lack of accessible shelter for folks in our region. According to the AIA, 28% of Midwest households face some sort of energy insecurity in 2015. 19% of those going so far as reducing or foregoing food or medicine in order to pay their energy costs. And we know that the COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated those numbers before we're even talking about what the source of that energy that they're trying to pay for would be. We also know that those trends, bad enough as they are not equally distributed in terms of racial demographics. Black households and Hispanic households were both around 2 times more likely to experience a utility shutoff at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's important to us that as we look at addressing the need to decarbonize buildings, that we're also doing it in a way that serves everybody. When we're talking about, programs for development and buildings in this country, going back to the initial and ongoing displacement of Indigenous folks in the country, to the usage and exploitation of slave labor to build so much of the initial building stock and infrastructure of this country. We know that other types of investments have more represented the picture on the left, where the benefits of those projects have really accrued mostly to one group, with other groups maybe barely getting enough to function on, or actively being sacrificed and ending up worse off than they were at the beginning of the project. So we know that for this project of building decarbonization, we can't even just settle for equal distribution of these benefits. We have to actively be working towards equity and making sure that everybody is getting the specific resources that they need to meet the challenges of the climate crisis head on, or ultimately being liberated from those issues entirely. Okay, so with that table setting, what are the challenges that we're working to overcome as a coalition? A fair number of the challenges that we're working on are based in the utilities that provide power to most of these buildings. I think folks coming into this work for the first time sometimes think that, well, the utilities have energy efficiency programs, they should be natural partners on some of this. There are a few barriers there that we have to work around. So most of the utilities, and certainly yours in Wisconsin, have a mandate from state regulators to provide energy efficiency programs, but a lot of them are governed by rules that include rules around fuel switching that actively prevent them from using that money to convert somebody from natural gas to electricity. So basically, they're set up to give you a better version of what you already have. If you're replacing an aging gas furnace, they'll let you put in a better gas furnace, but they will not pay to convert that building to a heat pump. So that's definitely a barrier that prevents a lot of people from having help meeting the cost of some of these conversions. They're also governed by cost effectiveness rules that are really laser focused on ensuring a certain dollar amount of savings to ratepayers per amount of money spent on that program, which sounds great, but it ends up really making those programs focused on new construction and developers or higher income households, because then they only need to cover a small portion of the cost to convince somebody to make upgrades on an appliance, as opposed to lower income households that probably need almost the full cost of the project covered. It just doesn't end up looking like as good of a bang for the buck on the utilities books. And so as a result, a lot of the folks that end up needing help the most effectively get locked out of those programs. They're also not very holistic. This kind of ties back to the cost effectiveness rules, but a lot, the utility program that I think most people are familiar with is this idea of like a rebate for a specific piece of equipment, like an air conditioner or a furnace. But if there are needs in terms of upgrading an electrical panel to install a piece of equipment, or addressing other repairs in a building before you can put that piece of equipment in, those programs typically aren't covering those things. So again, if that's not something that a homeowner or a small business can cover the cost of on their own, they're not going to participate in that program or get any benefit from it. The other challenge with utilities is this idea of rate structure. So while we are seeing increases in natural gas prices, historically, we've been up against comparatively low natural gas prices compared to the cost of electric heating. It wouldn't necessarily have to be that way. There are reasons why it would also benefit the electric utilities to offer people more advantageous rates if they are utilizing electric heating, because it spreads out their electrical use throughout the year into the winter, where electric usage would be lower because there's not air conditioners running and things like that. But utilities have been very slow to adopt those types of rates that would make things more attractive for people. And again, if you're talking to high energy burden households, there's a balance there in terms of, can we really encourage them to move on to a type of heating that may end up being more expensive for them if they're already in a bad financial situation. So that's something that needs to be addressed. And specific to you guys, I will say that Wisconsin is in their quadrennial utility process right now. So that's an every 4 years process that comes up where they evaluate the utility efficiency programs. In Wisconsin, it's called Focus on Energy. And that process is open for public comment right now. I can, when we get to questions, I'll drop the link to the Utility Commission's website where you can do that. And our friends at RMI are also working with some Wisconsin groups and have stipends available to help people participate in that process. So if that's something that anybody is interested in, I'm happy to follow up with anybody and get you hooked up with those folks. Another challenge that we're up against in terms of equity is this idea of split incentives, especially when it comes to the nationally 30% of folks that are renting their home. So on one side, you have developers and landlords that are probably shouldering the upfront cost for any decarbonization project for their building. And on the other side, the tenants were the ones that are concerned with the impact on their utility bills and are going to get the benefits in terms of health and comfort from that decarbonization process. And so really a challenge that we're trying to meet is how do we bridge that gap between those two groups, where one has all of the decision-making power in the relationship and the other one is dealing with the impact of those decisions. And then in terms of workforce, there are some additional challenges as well. So there's just a general shortage of skilled technicians. HVAC and electric are both fields that really just have an aging workforce that hasn't been being replaced and is retiring rapidly. Some of them, as trends continue, anticipate that there may be as high as a 50% shortage of necessary workers in the field by 2030. And then on top of that, a lot of the ones that are in the field are just not familiar with some of the technology involved with decarbonization. They're operating on outdated information. So just anecdotally, when I started as an engineer, I got told we don't spec heat pumps on air source heat pumps on projects unless there's no possible way to run a gas service out to the site, because 20 years ago, it was certainly the case that the technology had not caught up to operate properly in cold climates. And so there were definite issues when you hit those peak heating days of the systems having to convert over to straight electric heating, and it got really expensive. The technology has improved immensely in, I would say, the last 5 years, but plumbing and heating contractors just haven't fully gotten that message yet. They're not advocating for that when they're taking calls on people needing to have their furnaces replaced. We even hear quite a few stories of folks that wanted to put in a heat pump and they've had their contractors actively try to talk them out of it. So that's just a challenge we're up against, of educating that group as well. And then it's a field that has major equity gaps as well. This is maybe where the challenge of the worker shortage becomes a bit of an opportunity. So around 13% of the US workforce is Black. A study that a group that E2 did indicated that in clean energy fields, that representation dropped down to 6 or 8%. And then if you dive deeper into those statistics, you'll find that even that 6 to 8% really gets clustered in sort of the entry level jobs in clean energy or HVAC. As you move up into roles that get defined as like engineer or architect, it's only around 6%, and then construction manager roles or things like that are only around 3%. So we just know that this is a field that folks from BIPOC or other underserved communities are having difficulty advancing in, need additional assistance to make a career out of it when they're entering the field. And this is something that needs to get addressed when we're talking about equitably distributing the benefits of this project. And then just a few other assorted challenges. One is just the lack of state or local policy support for this type of work. You know, especially in the Midwest, where we have a lot of red or purple leaning states. These are not endeavors that developers or building owners like to take on their own. In my experience, there needs to be a little bit of legislative encouragement to get them to undertake it. And we just have a lack of that right now in the Midwest. I can speak from technical experience that existing buildings are messy. You know, when you're talking about addressing decarbonizing transportation, not that that's easy, but you can assume that we're just taking gas burning cars off the road and replacing them with electric. I'll get back to that 80% number of the buildings that we're going to have in 2050 are already here. They're not going to get replaced. We're going to have to deal with the existing building stock. And those projects are just always complicated and difficult projects. Ask any architect, engineer, or contractor that you may know. There are some existing or technical issues with the ability of the grid to accommodate more electric heating that need to get worked out. I think that's an argument that sometimes gets brought up in bad faith by folks trying to slow down progress on decarbonization, but there are some real concerns there. And that's why it's important also that we don't just electrify buildings, that we also do that energy efficiency piece to mitigate that impact. And then the final one is just sort of a lot of the stuff that you do to decarbonize just isn't very flashy, and it's not the most visible thing. You know, I think a lot of groups get excited about clean power generation because you can put up solar panels or something like that, and that's like a very visible thing to the community that people get excited about, and it's easy to get people engaged with it. The next time somebody drives by a building and says like, oh man, that's so cool that they put in 2 extra inches of insulation and have an electric heat pump serving the building, will be the first time I hear of that happening. So, so there's a little bit of a public relations into it too. So that's my presentation. If any of this sparked with you, we'd be happy to have any of you engage more with the coalition. My co-director, Marnice Jackson, runs an orientation session the 4th Tuesday of every month. You can contact her directly by email or register for that on our website. That's probably the best way to kind of learn about all the other stuff that we're doing to get at this issue. We're also on all of the social media channels and try to do a good job of putting out resources on this topic to folks out there. But I'll stop sharing now and just take any questions that folks might have had over the course of the presentation.
Can you give any costs, for instance, you know, what it would cost to put in a heat pump versus a gas furnace, or converting? And
Yeah.
people always talk about payback, so you know, what kind of a payback period can people expect?
Yeah, so I just kind of ran the numbers for my house, because I know our furnace is approaching the end of its life here. And I estimated between equipment and labor that was probably around a $5,000 project. But that was also before looking at if we had enough amperage on our electric panel to serve a heat pump. So there would be additional electrician costs to do that as well. And then if converting a water heater, that's probably more like a $2,500 project. And that is a place where there's been some exciting progress made, where manufacturers are specifically looking at versions of that technology that would run on a regular 120 volt outlet and not require running a new like higher voltage breaker out of your panel. So that's a technology that we're hoping is going to get cheaper for folks to make a conversion to really in the next 1 to 2 years. But yeah, it's not it's certainly something that is very cost effective for new construction. I know there was just a study done because Michigan is in the process of upgrading their building code, and they looked at it and saw that it would probably actually be cheaper to do all electric based building code for Michigan when you factor in the cost of not having to run that gas service up to the building. So I think on new construction, it's less of a cost concern, but for existing homes that weren't designed around having that in, there are definitely concerns that can add up quick. And that's why we know that we need government or utility run programs that have flexibility to help people really address some of those other costs that come with it, not just that one piece of equipment getting installed.
I have one question too. Jacob, it's the coalition that you are representing.
Yeah.
Is the coalition, who else is involved in the coalition? Is it government? Is it educational, technical schools, unions?
Yep. So I would say that we are typically on, well, there's a range. So on one end, we have larger policy or research-based organizations that are very good about engaging with our coalition and sharing resources out to people. And then we have a number of smaller community or environmental justice-based groups that engage with us. And one thing that I didn't talk about that our coalition does is that 40% of our operating budget goes to a re-granting program to help finance projects that those smaller organizations in our coalition are trying to do. So our first round actually just went out. We're hoping to do a second round here in the fall, but one of the projects actually was a church decarbonization project for a church in Indiana that has some coalition members in it. But I think that's kind of the main function that we're serving right now in the Midwest, is connecting some of these larger, better resourced organizations with more folks that are on the ground doing some of this work in the Midwest. I think the next step of engagement for us would be bringing in more of technical colleges and things like that. But that just hasn't kind of been where we've been at in our growth phase right now.
Thanks.
Also piggybacking on Lorraine's question, is the Midwest Renewable Energy Association part of your coalition?
No, we have other renewable energy groups at the state level, but I don't believe that they have engaged with us yet. Not like we're at odds with it or anything, and just slightly different focuses from each other with what we're focused on right now.
Well, they have a big energy fair, in mid-state. And I think it would be really a great thing if you, I don't know if you go to those things, energy fairs and things like that, but
yeah, admittedly, as an organization, we got founded and then COVID started like immediately after that. So we're sort of like just now grappling with what our strategy is in terms of getting to stuff in person, just because it wasn't something we could do for the first couple of years of our operation. So, and I know, individually where we're located, all of our staff people are pretty plugged in with what's happening in our areas, and we have good coalition members in all of those states. But yeah, we're still kind of trying to work out what a physical presence for us looks like.
okay.
It's good work. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for having.
Yeah.
And I'll just drop my email here in the chat. Oh, sorry. That was not the whole thing. But I'm happy to follow up with any other questions that people have later on, or if you've got specific things, try to connect you with folks in the coalition. If you've got specific resources you're looking for, happy to do that.
Okay.
How many communities have ground sourced what when the communities do that, is it ground sourced electricity? No, I mean a ground sourced heat, and how does that work?
Yeah, I will I'll send you a link to an article. So this is sort of like an exciting trending thing that we've seen popping up in the Midwest, where basically instead of having an individual geothermal heat pump system for every building, that you would have a group of buildings served by one central system, kind of like the old central steam pipe system that serves multiple buildings.
Yeah.
Except it's a heat pump. So there is a small town, West Union in Iowa, that has a system like that that serves multiple buildings in their downtown, and the city runs it, and folks can just pay a monthly fee to the city for access to that system, same as you would your electric bill. And they found that that's been very cost competitive with what they would have been paying for their gas heating for their buildings. There's a proposed development in Minneapolis that would run, that would have that type of system. And then there's a couple of colleges around the Midwest that have been converting their old steam and chilled water systems to that type of system. So Carleton College in Minnesota has that. Ball State down in Indiana has a system like that. And we're actively working with a Wisconsin-based partner, Slipstream, to do some outreach to other cities and colleges that we think would be good candidates to implement that type of system as well. So we're hoping that's a trend that we see more of.
So are there individual homes that are in any of these places that are on those systems?
Yeah, so I believe the West Union system, it's mostly commercial buildings around their downtown. Outside of the Midwest, I know there's a big one down in Texas that was like a big housing development that did something like that. So there's definitely models for that type of thing. That Towerside project in Minneapolis that they're trying to get built would have, I don't know if it's single family homes. I think it would be multifamily, but definitely would be residential. And then there are some pilot projects with utilities in Massachusetts that I believe would serve individual family homes. That's a case where they have some more forward-thinking gas utilities out there that are actually looking at converting some of their service systems in certain communities to that type of concept to see if that's a business model for them going forward, right? I think some of those gas utilities are starting to see the writing on the wall that they need to start thinking about what the future of their business looks like, and that they need to start considering some of these other services that they can offer. So there's like sporadic examples of this getting done, but certainly would like to see more of it, especially in the Midwest, where that would be a really effective way to meet the heating need. That would probably end up actually being more cost effective at scale than individual air source heat pumps would be for folks. So we're working on it. I think Denver is also looking at one, and that one is interesting because they're actually looking at pulling the heat for the system out of their sewage system. So basically all the waste heat out of their sewage line would then get transferred into heating to meet some of that need. So there's some cool stuff out there. Just needs to kind of get that proof of concept so people get comfortable with doing it.
Now, those places, do they use wells, or do they, can they actually have enough space to, dig ditches and put in?
Yeah, there's lots of different ways that you can do it. Some of them are, directly tapping into the aquifer. Some of them are closed loops that go down into a well field. And then there are the other examples like that Denver project, or, theoretically, as some of these big data centers go up, that would be a big source of waste heat that could get pulled into some of these systems. So there's lake-based geothermal systems that kind of have like a floating heat exchanger. So there's lots of different ways at getting at it. It's sort of just what makes sense on a site-by-site basis, with what the resources at hand are in terms of space or water or some other heat source.
Yeah.
Well, you've certainly confirmed for me that this is a very large issue with many arms. Yes.
Yeah. It's a lot, and I think a lot of folks, we kind of try to help them find it's my job to worry about all of the arms. I'll try to find you, which corner of this makes sense for you to engage with the most. So,
well, I'm glad you're working on it, because then that makes me feel somebody is. That's good. That's good. I'm glad you are.
Yeah, it was incredibly well done talk.
Yes.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
All right.
It'll
Well,
be
again, thanks for having us.
It'll be recorded. It'll be on the YouTube channel for the church. So we
Yeah.
can direct people there too. I think daylight savings time did us in this morning, but plus the change of time we've had.
Yep.
So,
Right.
sorry.
So-
Yeah.
Yeah, it is recorded, so we do get
Mhm.
quite a few views after the fact.
All right.
Yeah, and we have a large social justice group that is
Yeah.
interested in environmental issues. So I really thank you very much.
No
Yes,
problem.
thank
It's
you
my
so much.
pleasure. All right.